Welcome back to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Richmond, and joining me today is co-host Alex Brown for another episode of Wiretaps. Alex, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Graham.
So this is kind of a crazy time of year. It's almost like, it's obviously baseball playoffs in October, but I always get excited in October for kind of MBA admissions results as they start to trickle in. And, the first sign of results is always those Harvard Business School interview invitations, which we know went out last week for the round one applicant pool. So that was a crazy week last week with that, and obviously Duke's early decision interview invites as well. We track this stuff on Livewire where candidates are sharing these updates to the minute, and also in our chat rooms where people are chatting as they wait to kill time and I guess find camaraderie as they kind of wait to hear decisions. So appreciate all the activity on the site last week. Any thoughts about what do we say to those, most people who were kind of rejected in round one at HBS since they interview such a small number?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. The beginning of the season starts with the most or one of the most competitive programs releasing decisions. So it can be a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for some of the real high-caliber candidates that are applying that aren't successful in terms of getting an interview invite. And many of those candidates will end up in a top-tier program in one of the M7s, no doubt in my mind. So it's a question of sort of knuckling down, take the hit, and continue on if you fall in that bracket. And if you're one of the lucky ones, not lucky I shouldn't say, but one of the ones that receive an interview invite, the Harvard interview is a little bit tricky in terms of it's what we call a non-blind interview, and it can be feel a little unnerving when the interviewer is really pushing you on something that you might have written in an essay or something like that. So prepare very well, and the best way to do that, I think, is simply reread your applications, really know your stories, as you should anyway. And, at Clear Admit, we have a couple of resources that can be helpful, not least of which is our interview archive that has a lot of interview reports from those that have already interviewed at Harvard.
Yeah, I think it's, the fact that those Harvard interviews, they heat the room up and they nail the windows shut and they sort of see, but no, just in all seriousness, the Harvard interview it's challenging. I mean, it's not a mean interview, but it's challenging. And we actually recorded some time ago a podcast, which has got to be somewhere in the archives here, that is a podcast all about how to interview at HBS. So I definitely recommend if you are one of the ones who's got an interview invitation for HBS, give that a listen. And as Alex said, go to the interview archive. We've got literally hundreds of reports of people who've interviewed at HBS, sharing the questions they were posed and, just sort of sharing their experience. And we also have a Harvard interview guide. I don't like to sort of push our products and stuff because we know you're listening and we value your time. So I don't want to push, but we do sell an interview guide to HBS too. So you can check that out. I guess this week, it's a little more quiet, but there's still, everyone's still working on applications, waiting for news. LBS is one of those schools that's going to give some interview invitations out later this week. So stay tuned there. And as always, we'll have the chat rooms running on the site. If you want to kind of get together with fellow applicants, by all means do so. Without further ado, though, let's get into the nitty gritty here and start talking about some candidates, and we have some really interesting profiles this week. Alex, thanks once again for picking out 4 terrific folk for us to talk about. So without further ado, let's dive in and talk about Wiretaps candidate number 1. So this person is looking to start in 2020 and has been working in engineering, looking to transition over to consulting, GMAT 690, GPA 3.93, years of work experience. The entry says 74. I'm guessing that it's either 7 or 4, not really sure, but it sounds like it's probably 7 if I had to guess from the comments that the person left. And they mentioned they want to transition from a technical role in the clean energy industry to management consulting in the energy industry. And the target schools are Tepper, Johnson, Emory, Georgetown, and UNC Kenan-Flagler. So, Alex, what did you make of this candidate? You guys had some discussion on the site, and he also did share that he's a white male U.S. citizen and that the undergrad was, in chemical engineering from a top 50 private college. So, yeah, what do you think?
Well, the person is obviously super smart. I mean, to get a 393 chemical engineering degree is ridiculously impressive.
Yeah.
I think, which is unfortunate in terms of you balance that against the GMAT score, where they got an overall 690, which is within range certainly of the schools that they're selecting, and actually might hit the median of some of these schools. But it just seems to me that 690 is low relative to having a 393 chemical engineering degree, and it turns out that it's the verbal aspect of the GMAT that's the trouble.
You know, what's weird, I got to interrupt you there. What's weird is he says that, right? He left this comment and he says, I always get a 38 on the practice test. I've had trouble raising the verbal. So I just did a little digging because he shared with us his raw scores. So he says 47 quant, 38 verbal. And so I dug it up, and a 38 verbal is 85th percentile, which isn't bad. What was shocking to me is that the 47 quant is only 60th percentile. So I was puzzled by this candidate's focus on their verbal. Maybe it's just that the verbal's never moved, no matter how many times they take the test. But I was like, wow, if I'm looking to get points, there's a little ways to climb on the math, even though I recognize the math is incredibly punishing. Like you miss 4 or 5 questions, you're already down at the 60th percentile or 70th percentile. So it's more punishing. But I was a little, that was just confusing to me. I didn't understand where the candidate was going with that line of discussion.
Right. Yeah, I guess on the raw numbers, it looks like it's lower on the verbal side.
Right.
But relative to others taking the test, that's maybe not the case. And certainly with a 393 chemical engineering degree, you're not going to worry about the candidate's quant chops so much. So I guess they were angling it from that point of view. But they've retaken the test, and they've obviously not been able to improve. So that's unfortunate. If the candidate has some potential concern on the verbal side, one of the things that they perhaps can do is make sure that their recommenders address this issue directly in their recommendation. So making sure it's highlighted that the candidate has strong communication skills, and those sorts of things to try to sort of mitigate that particular issue. The candidate has decent volunteer experiences, also quite well rounded, so that's very nice, especially again from a hardcore engineer. And talks about sort of some of the team experience and stuff like that at work, which is obviously very important. So as long as they can show really good impact at work, I think that will be very, very good. I thought that the candidate's school selection was a little, I think they could be a little bit more ambitious. Maybe selecting 1 or 2 additional schools from the top 16. But again, it's the GMAT pulls them down. I mean, if this candidate, let's say, had a 730, 740 GMAT with a 3.9 GPA chemical engineering, could show impact at work, has had good goals, and has this good volunteer experience, you'd be like, why wouldn't he or she be an M7 sort of candidate? So it really stresses me a little bit that the difference of 10 or 20 points on the GMAT could limit this person. That all being said, I was looking at Livewire when Harvard was releasing its interview invites, over the last week, and there were candidates getting interview invites with 680s, 690s on their GMAT, and we know that people are successful with these scores. So maybe I'm reading a bit too much into that. What do you think, Graham?
Yeah, it's a tough call. I mean, I agree. This candidate, there's a lot to like here. I actually, that GPA is pretty stunning. The fear that I had was one of these, it's the sort of stereotyping of the engineer, right? So it's like, chemical engineer, good with chemicals, not with people, kind of thing. So that's something they're going to have to go against. But then you see some of the volunteer work. They mentioned they're doing some volunteer work with a Buddhist nonprofit organization. That's not what you would normally think of an engineer getting involved in. So that's great. That's kind of that well-rounded piece.
And the sustainable farming, teaching sustainable farming, that's pretty slick.
Yeah, very cool stuff. So I really like this candidate, and I didn't mean to go too hard on the GMAT stuff, but I just was puzzling over the percentiles and stuff. But I think I agree with you that it wouldn't be a bad idea to take a flyer on a school in that next rung up from where they're currently fishing. Certainly couldn't hurt. Yeah, I mean, I like this candidate. I just, one of the things I was kind of curious to know, just a better understanding of the career plan. So they talk about, going from kind of engineering and the kind of technical side over to consulting and working in the energy sector still. It'd be great to hear the names of the firms that they think do really well in that domain. So I would encourage them, because if they are going to get into a top school with a lower than average GMAT score, they're going to need everything else to be buttoned up. And so I think to the extent that they can say, these are the 4 consulting firms that do a lot of work in the domain that I'm interested in, and those 4 firms may not be Bain, BCG, McKinsey, the usual suspects. It might be a slightly different list, which would show that the person had, done their homework. Maybe there's a boutique type firm in there that does hire MBAs, but is a bit focused on the energy sector or whatever it could be. So that would help to round this person out. But otherwise, I think, look, they've taken this test a couple times. I would probably just include a kind of disclaimer that says, look, I've taken the test multiple times. The GMAT's not really my forte, and I'm hoping that my undergraduate performance in a fairly rigorous major will give the committee confidence in my ability to excel in the MBA program. It's like that simple of a optional essay, really short, and just leave it at that.
And fairly rigorous is quite a modest qualifier for chemical engineering, I think.
Yes. Yep, exactly.
And also, what is this person's long-term goal? As we know, a lot of candidates have ambition going into consulting post-MBA. That makes perfect sense. But the majority of those will ultimately be exiting consulting, moving on into industry or something post a consulting stint. So maybe there's something there to explore also as part of the narrative.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good advice. Anything else on this one, or should we move on to number 2 here?
No, I think that's good.
All right, so wiretaps candidate number 2. So this person is looking to start business school next fall. So they're currently applying, and they've actually, in a rare instance here, they've actually submitted applications to the schools we're about to talk about. So they're kind of in play. They've been working in M&A for a private company. And post-MBA, they want to get into consulting, tech, or maybe even private equity. GRE is 325, GPA is a 3.9, and 4 years of work experience to date, located in Texas and hoping to be in the Northeast post-MBA. Target schools are Tepper, Tuck, MIT Sloan, and UVA Darden. And, this person left us a pretty substantial note where they kind of explained their career evolution and, this desire to kind of get into maybe consulting post-MBA and then transition in the long term. They also mentioned that their GRE is kind of lopsided. I think their numbers are off here, but they said a 366 quant and a 359 verbal. I think they mean 166 quant and 159 verbal. And then, so they're kind of curious if we had any feedback on that. And they mentioned that they had already interviewed at Dartmouth, which is, as all of our listeners probably know, a school where you can just sign up for an interview. And they felt that interview went well, and they're excited about Tuck as their kind of top choice. So what's your take on this candidate?
Yeah, very interesting. I think that there's lots to like here. Again, 3.9 GPA, so super smart person. And then they say they've taken classes like game theory, calculus, econometrics, and stuff like that. So that's all very good. Their first comment after their note was, one other thing, I have a solid and unique volunteer experience tutoring inmates at a local prison each week. And I just thought that was wonderful. That's the sort of thing that really will resonate with AdCom as a volunteer experience. Why did you choose that volunteer experience? What have you learned from that volunteer experience? I think if this candidate sort of really able to articulate those two things, as well as the fact that they're doing it, I really think that's going to be somewhat of a unique story that's really going to help set them apart, regardless of everything else. So, I mean, that's why we're talking about this candidate this week. I just love the fact that they're doing something like this. It's something that I would not even had thought to do myself in my life. So I'm completely fascinated by that. So, and I know that probably brings in some bias on my part, but that's the problem with, when applications are being reviewed by admissions officers, we all do have our little biases, right? So you can't really get away from that. But anyway, fantastic potential volunteer experience there that could really set the theme for this candidate. The candidate does a good job sort of explaining their work. I'm sure their work is meaningful, the impact, and so on and so forth looks really good, even though that they consider it to be a little bit non-traditional or less orthodox. Tighten up on the goals, make sure the goals are nice and focused. And obviously there's a lot of relationship between consulting tech, private equity. I mean, private equity is a bit of a reach to step into, as we know, but I do honestly, Graham, I think there's a lot to like here, and fair play interviewing already at Tuck. I'd expect that from candidates that know what they're doing. Is this candidate being ambitious enough?
That's a good question. I mean, I liked this candidate as well. Little pro tip for our listeners, though, you don't want to be doing the tutoring of inmates from within prison. So, make sure that,
yes.
but no, it is an interesting outside activity. This person seemed concerned by the fact that they're working for a smaller kind of private company doing M&A work. And I guess they were worried that it's not like they're coming from some big brand firm. I'm less concerned about that, particularly given the target schools on their list. And I think most MBA programs are going to be open to people coming from different, backgrounds. I think, could they aim a little bit higher? I mean, I got a sense from looking at this school selection that they're clearly going for the kind of smaller, close-knit vibe. And so, I guess, you could say, well, what about, Stanford? But they want to be in the Northeast afterwards. And obviously Stanford is a big reach for anyone. And so, yeah. So I think it's, there could be other schools that might make sense. But I mean, these four are a good starting point. They seem like they're really in love with Tuck. So
no, I was going to say, and if they've applied to these four schools in the first round, I mean, they'll get good feedback before round two applications are due. So they'll know at that point whether they should be stepping up a little bit or what they should be doing. But having these four in the bag in round one, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. To the point of working at a smaller firm, schools, again, they want to bring in people from lots of different experiences and different firms and so on and so forth. It's just going to be incumbent on this candidate in this case, of really articulating the meaningfulness of the impacts they've had at work and the leadership experiences and so on and so forth. If you've come from McKinsey or you've come from, a bulge bracket investment bank or whatever it is, sure, AdCom already knows some stuff. If you haven't come from those places, you've got to do the educating a little bit. But it doesn't mean to say that if you haven't come from those places, that you're already at a disadvantage. The only other wrinkle to all that is if you're coming from McKinsey or a bulge bracket or a top tech firm, AdCom understand you've been through some kind of rigorous admissions process to get those roles. So just recognize that also.
Yeah, agreed. I guess for me, I would echo your sentiment that the goals needed some work, just some fleshing out, but that's not a hard thing to do. One note on the GRE, their overall score of 325 it's solid. It's not elite, like it's good enough to get into a top program, but it's below the average at some of the very elite schools, which aren't on their list at the moment. The quantitative percentile was 70th. They were in the 70th percentile, which, for an M&A guy, I was wondering a little bit about that. And then the verbal was at the 97th percentile, so clearly nothing to really improve on there. So, but I think, yeah, working on the goals a bit, and yeah, see how things go. I really like their chances with their number one choice in Tuck at this point.
Yeah, really interesting candidate.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on and discuss Wiretaps candidate number 3. So this candidate is not looking to start until 2022. They're currently working in healthcare, kind of business development and consulting. And post-MBA, they want to do consulting and maybe even entrepreneurship. target companies right out of business school are going to be Bain, BCG, and McKinsey. Score on the GRE is 332. GPA 3.24. Currently, this candidate has 2 years of work experience and is located in the Netherlands, hoping to be in Africa long term, and that's because this candidate actually is from, I believe, from sub-Saharan Africa, and went to the Netherlands for university, and I guess has stayed there to work. Target schools are Harvard Business School, HEC Paris, Oxford, Wharton, and Yale. And you guys had a running dialogue on the site about their candidacy, and so I should actually mention that they started their notes on their profile by saying, "Hello, I love listening to the Wiretaps podcast and would love to be featured in it." So here you go. So Alex, what do you think of this candidate?
And that's why they're featured.
Right.
That, and actually there's some interesting stuff to talk about here. This candidate will bring something, again, quite different to an MBA program, which I think is very good. So they're from sub-Saharan Africa. They went to the Netherlands to do their undergraduate, and they've sort of been navigating the healthcare space. They started involved in a startup coming out of college that was less unsuccessful. They've done some other things. They've had a lot of different types of experiences, and their concern is that their undergraduate record isn't outstanding, and they didn't go to an outstanding school. So that's one of their concerns. They have a good GRE score, I think very good GRE score, actually 332. So the person's smart, and for the sakes of argument, let's assume their experience to date, it's only a couple of years, but has been strong relative to early experience. Their goals in the healthcare sector, going back to Africa, and sort of really making an impact and a difference in sub-Saharan Africa in the long run. So schools are going to love that. And the fact that they're already working in that sort of space, and their background and their profile resonates for that, is also going to be very good. This candidate is debating they're telling us that they're going to go do a master's degree in some kind of related subject matter, master's in biopharmaceutical management next year. Try to get a job at a larger firm, which is kind of the same issue, I guess, as our previous candidate. What's the deal with going to a smaller, less known firm versus a larger firm? Get a job at a larger firm to then set themselves up for the MBA. My refrain from that is, why go do the master's if you can continue challenging yourself now for the next couple of years, really do well, ramp up, seek the tough projects or whatever it is at work, possibly take one or two classes just to show that you're a straight A student now, through some kind of continuing education program, and then apply to top business schools. I think if the person goes for a master's simply to get a good degree on their resume, to get a bit of a brand, to help them get into a different firm, again, get a better brand on their resume before the business school, I don't think that's the best route. Graham, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was puzzled by this. I mean, so first of all, they already have 2 years of work experience. They have a really interesting background in terms of making the move from Africa to Netherlands for undergrad. And also there's some context to the GPA. So the GPA is low. It's a 3.24, right? But they happen to actually be managing a startup while they were pursuing their undergraduate degree. It was a supply chain startup that helped, with transferring goods or things between the EU and Africa, right? So they have this pretty intense experience. They also had some health problems in college. So part of me was like, you know what? Just explain that. Look at the GRE. It is a massive score. This is well above the averages, even at Stanford or Harvard, or whatever, right? So I feel like they could explain this away, put their head down at work, like you say, seek out challenging, opportunities over the next year. And I would almost argue they could apply next fall and aim to start a year earlier than they're currently thinking, or even 2 years earlier if they. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things that this candidate has done. They do some very interesting volunteer work. They're running a scholarship at their secondary school back in Africa, sponsoring kids to do their studies. So I feel like there's a lot to like here. And then it got me thinking, well, maybe if they have this interest in biotech or pharma, they could be targeting some of the programs that are joint degree or specialization. So both Duke and Wharton have really strong kind of healthcare management MBA offerings, and there's even HBS has this new dual degree that they've introduced in biotech and life sciences for people with this kind of background. So I feel like they don't need this other master's, or they could at least get it all at once, or just pursue an MBA that's kind of specialized. So that was that was my take. I liked the profile, but I felt like they were kind of heading down the wrong path in terms of the strategy they've shared with us.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is somewhat symptomatic of someone earlier in the pipeline thinking about this stuff, which is great. And hopefully, we can help them think through the sort of things that they're planning to pursue. And I would even argue that getting that master's could present an issue applying again to a top tier school, because it already has a management component to it. So you're going to have to make the case of then pursuing an MBA subsequent to that. So yeah, I think if the person doesn't decide to pursue that master's, knuckles down at work, really pushes themselves, if they have an opportunity to go to a larger firm, and they think that will present them more challenges over the next year or two, then fair play, go take that opportunity. But really seek out those challenges, really go after that development, and maybe, in a couple of years' time, add Stanford to this list also. This guy wants to make an impact in a part of the world where you really need people with passion that have the chops to make the impact. And that's what top-tier business schools are seeking. So fair play, do the right things. This guy being gender neutral, I presume, but I think that this candidate sets up to be someone that really elite schools are going to be seeking.
Yeah, I think the one wild card is we don't have a ton of information on the current role. I presume they're not just answering phones at this consulting firm, that they're actually doing consulting and biz dev work. So hopefully there is opportunity, and they're in the Netherlands. Presumably it's a reputable firm, and so yeah, as long as there's opportunity there, they should go for it and probably just take the next year to ramp up their work experience and then start looking at these top business schools. The one thing I wanted to mention, because I think some of our listeners might be curious, is, you see this list of Harvard, HEC Paris, Oxford, Wharton, and Yale, and some people might scratch their heads and say that's kind of all over the map. There's some European schools, but my guess is, given that this person wants to return to Africa, there's probably some emphasis just being placed on global brand with respect to the institution, the university at large. So Yale, obviously top MBA program, but also globally well-respected university and well-known university, even in, the far corners of the world, right? So I think Wharton is the same. Oxford obviously is coming in for that reason too, I'm guessing. And then HEC Paris is obviously, a great MBA program, but also one that is, as an institution, HEC is very well known in Africa, where there's a lot of French speakers. And so there are reasons, I think, for this list. So it seems like a well-crafted list to me, given this candidate's goals. But I just wanted to mention that in case some of our listeners were kind of saying, I haven't seen that kind of a list before,
Right. And it's also symptomatic if your long-term goal or even short-term coming out is to be in a region of the world where there aren't a cluster of top-tier MBA programs, then you could see more diversity in the actual location of the MBA programs in the candidates' sort of list of target schools. I mean, to me, that makes good sense.
Yep, that's fair. So without further ado, I guess let's move on to Wiretap's candidate number 4. So this candidate is looking to start in 2020, so next fall. They've been working in social impact and are looking to make the move over to kind of consulting, but with a nonprofit social impact bent to it. Their GMAT score is a 710. GPA is a 6.6 out of a 10 scale, and 3 years of work experience. This candidate is in India. And post MBA, they're open, but would love to be in Europe or maybe Singapore. And they left a really helpful comment that explained a little bit more about the GMAT result and that score of a 710, which we'll get into. They asked us a number of pointed questions about like what they should do in terms of some of the strategy around their academic profile in particular. And then the last thing I want to mention is they also said that they are a regular listener of Cleared Myths podcast. Especially, they say they can't start my Mondays without it. So that made me smile. Great to hear that. So thanks for that. And they mentioned they're in India. They're an Indian male, age 26. So Alex, what's your take on this candidate who obviously falls into a kind of overrepresented portion of the applicant pool?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting aspects to this candidacy, and obviously, like you mentioned just right at the very end, the challenge will be, differentiating themselves and distinguishing themselves from a very strong group of other candidates applying, so Indian male and so forth. So they have a 710 on the GMAT. They're basic planning to retake that. They really want to push it, I guess, into that sort of 730, 740 region. And by doing that, that sort of sits them into the second round of the application cycle. Whereas I would prefer to see candidates from overrepresented populations coming in the first round before a bunch of similarly profiled candidates have already been admitted to the schools that they're targeting. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So one of the question was from the candidate was whether they could apply to Oxford and INSEAD, I think it was, in their November round, whilst planning to retake the GMAT a little bit later. My advice based on that, Graham, and I'd like to hear your opinion directly, was typically European business schools, the average GMATs are slightly lower than US-based business schools, in my mind anyway. Maybe there's a little less focus on the GMAT score than there perhaps is across the water. So what they could do in that case is apply, but indicate in an optional essay the scheduled time for their retake and that they would follow up with that new score if appropriate. So what do you think to that, Graham?
Yeah, so you've reminded me that I didn't mention the target schools. So one of them is INSEAD, another is Oxford, as you said, and those schools have these kind of earlier quote round 2 type deadlines, or later round 1, whatever, however you want to think of it. And so they're wondering, like you said, can they get the current score in and then tell the school another one's forthcoming? They're also looking at the Indian School of Business, Harvard Business School, Duke, and Tuck, and Yale. So just so that our listeners know. As to the strategy here, I mean, you're right. I think the European schools do have a less of a focus on the GMAT. And the American me wants to make a funny joke about how it's just because, the Europeans aren't as smart or something. But the actual truth is that it's, I think it's just because there's not a culture of standardized testing in Europe the way there is in the United States, where you have the SATs or, the achievement tests and all these other exams that people are taking. So I think that's some of it. And in the interview I did with Virginie Fougère, who's the director of admissions at INSEAD, she really pushed that point that, GMAT's not everything and don't obsess around it. So I think this candidate's idea is perfectly fine. Like get the apps in to these schools in Europe, let them know that you're taking the test again. And then just sort of see where the chips fall. I do want to point out that, the 710 is not so bad. I mean, it's not a bad score. And I looked up the percentile scores, and the math percentile, 74th percentile, which is not that bad. I mean, again, as I was saying earlier, once you miss a few questions, it's really hard. There's so many people getting like perfect scores on the math that it sort of blows the curve. So in any event, I think, 74th quant and 85th percentile verbal. The thing that did jump out at me was that the integrated reasoning section result, unless I'm misreading what the candidate shared with us, put them in the 35th percentile. So that's really low. And I know people don't really focus on the integrated reasoning. It's the newer section. It's unclear how schools are using it, but that jumps out at me. And so I was kind of wondering if, I wanted to just mention to this person, if they're listening, that, when you take the test again, make sure you put your best foot forward on that section too, because getting a better score there will help. But yeah, so that's my take on that aspect. I think the academics are really the red flag here. I mean, I see this GPA of it's probably a 66% out of 100. I think that's how they typically do it in India. And it sounds like it's from a non-IIT, it's not from a top school. So that doesn't help either. With that said, I wanted to ask you a question about their work experience, because this person has been working really, even though they did an engineering program, they've been working in social impact, and they've been working with politicians and as a kind of a development consulting. They are part of a philanthropic foundation working in rural India on, projects related to water, agriculture, rural development. So I just wanted to get your take, because, when we talk about the kind of Indian male engineer who's overrepresented in the pool, they're not usually doing this kind of work.
No, and clearly I think their work experience is their point of differentiation. It's very interesting. It's, again, from an impact standpoint, this person can make a lot of impact, both in their current role and post-MBA as they continue to pursue this path. So schools will really like this aspect of the candidacy. To the extent they play that into the forefront, which obviously through the essays and so on and so forth, they can do that. I think that would be very, very helpful. The challenge will be this combination of their GPA and GMAT score. So to the extent, I don't know if they mentioned potentially taking any additional classes, so through executive education or something like that, to try to get a couple of A grades, but that might be another route to pursue.
Yeah, I guess one other thing they shared is that despite having a 66 out of 100, that their grade was actually in the top quartile of their class, so top 25%, and we do know that, you rarely see a candidate out of India with like a 90% out of 100. They're pretty harsh in their grading. And so, but usually, the top tier candidates are more in the 70s or even towards 80. So that's why this is, yeah.
And the candidate admits this is their issue, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like they're trying to mask it over. And ADCOM will know this is an issue, so they've got to address it up front. And you've given this advice before, Graham, by really acing the GMAT, that can help really mitigate that. And they've also done a postgrad diploma that helped them, I think, transition into the social impact role. So clearly that's been very influential in what they've been doing. I mean, I really want this candidate to do really well because, this is a potentially high impact person. So like the previous candidate who wants to do renewable energy, I think it was in sub-Saharan Africa. Is that what it was, Graham? It seems like such a long time ago since we were chatting about him, but it was only the last one.
I think it was healthcare, maybe.
Sorry, healthcare. Right? Yes. Yeah. I figured it was something different.
But but I think on a prior episode we had someone who was in. Yeah. So it's
But the point is, these candidates, like this Indian candidate, in the long run, can make very high impact. Rather than if they're super smart, they're going on to Wall Street afterwards or private equity or whatever. I mean. These are on the ground doing really impactful things that can really lift the quality of life for lots and lots of people, right? So business schools want these candidates to do well in their application process. So to the extent that this candidate can, schools will be rooting for them. I have no doubt about that. The challenge will be, again, that sort of profile, engineer, Indian male, coming into round 2, they're really going to have to play up this work differentiation.
Agreed. Yeah. So I wish them the best of luck. And again, thanks so much for the feedback. We love getting feedback on the podcast. It's just always nice to know that folks are tuning in. And actually on that note, to the extent that if you are a regular listener, to the extent that you could subscribe or even just tell a friend or two or leave us a review, that really helps make this podcast go around. So, you notice we don't have a ton of sponsors or anything like that. We're just trying to record these rapidly, get them out to you. So please support us any way that you can. Other than that, I did want to just remind people that we published a report about a week ago called the M7 Insights or Livewire M7 Insights report, where we actually shared a ton of data on how GPA, GMAT, and timing of interviews and admissions results goes at all the top 7 US MBA programs. So that's a really fun document, and it's free to download if you're a registered user on our site. So grab that. We've been getting some great feedback on that too. And then finally, we actually, I published a thought piece last week about why the MBA is still worth it. I encourage people to read that. I actually published that on LinkedIn, so just take a peek for that and spread the word on that piece as well. And yeah, we'll be back really soon. We've got there's so much happening on the wires at clearadmit.com that there's no shortage of things for Alex and I to talk about. So we'll be back with another episode next week. And Alex, thanks as always for your time and for picking out these candidates.
Yeah, great. I love this time of year.
All right, we will see everybody soon. Thanks again for listening.